Nevertheless, I think that there were some differences across Britain that make it harder for us to say that yes, the British were imperialist, or no, they were not. There were different responses to empire in different regions. For instance, in some schools across Britain, the empire would be celebrated, with classroom walls containing maps with all the parts of the empire painted red on them, and with pro-empire hymns being sung in assembly. But in other parts of Britain, support for the empire was less solid, less certain. In certain radical liberal strongholds, such as certain parts of Manchester and other bits of Lancashire, for instance, there wasn't such overt and rapturous enthusiasm for empire. So you can't assume that everyone thought the same thing at the same time. A good example of this is the war against the Afghans, to return briefly to that again. Whilst some felt that the war was wrong, at the same time you have very popular pro-war music hall songs that were cheered at too. I've got one example for you here. 1879, G.W. Hunt, the chap I mentioned earlier, he wrote a song called New Patriotic Song. Part of it went, "The Afghan wolf may friendship make with cunning Russian bear, but the Indian tiger's wide awake and bids them both beware. The prowling foe on plunder bent by this should surely know, the British lion's not asleep as in the years ago. The dusky sons of Hindustan will by our banner stand. Australia, I, and Canada both love the dear old land. No foe we fear, we fight for right, no day we e'er shall rue, if England, dear old England, to herself be only true." Now, the second thing I'd like to raise for you today is a way that you can critique the question. The question is asking about the popularity of imperialism, which implicitly assumes that imperialism was a single policy, but it wasn't. The empire was a very complicated phenomenon, made up of lots of different places that were ruled in different ways. So you have the White Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, which had been granted a certain amount of self-government for the most part in the middle of the 19th century. In these places, the white settlers marginalised the indigenous peoples, and in Canada and Australia in particular, ran the place as if they were effectively not there. These parts of the empire were felt to be closest to Britain. There was felt to be a blood tie between the British metropole and these places. Now, you don't need to tell me that this was very different to the way that India or Africa was run. These places were often run along the lines of what was called indirect rule, where the British supported indigenous rulers but worked behind the scenes to make sure that these indigenous rulers did what the British wanted. These places were felt to be very different to the White Dominions. India was the most prestigious of all of these. It was, as is well known, felt to be the jewel in the crown, the glitziest and most glamorous part of the empire. So some parts of the empire were felt to be direct extensions of Britain, whilst other parts were felt to be very different, strange, exotic. Therefore, it's unsurprising that people felt very differently about different parts of the empire. Very few people actively criticised the existence of the White Dominions. These were felt to be family. The British were justified to be there. And India, because it was prestigious, was also a place that most people thought should be part of the empire. You know, they had a long pedigree of being there since the mid-18th century in particular. It was felt that Britain, by dint of its ability and by dint of its governing policies, had effectively validated its right to be there. However, that doesn't mean that all aspects of running an empire were endorsed equally enthusiastically. The one thing that was the most contentious was the fighting of imperial wars. The large numbers of people who cheered at Gladstone's tirades opposing Britain's wars against the Afghans and against the Zulus is a case in point. Furthermore, there were some places that the British thought it would be foolish to control as part of the empire. The most notable of these was large swathes of sub-Saharan Africa. This aversion was because of the climate. It was felt that the British wouldn't be able to get south beyond Egypt or north beyond South Africa, that it would be too hard to station people there. So, in papers in the 1880s, you have some advising against the idea of expanding into what would become Uganda, due to the idea that this would be doomed to failure. Now, whilst this is criticism of empire, or a criticism of imperial policy in a particular region of what might become the empire, this isn't undermining the whole imperial construct. This isn't them implicitly opposing everything that empire stands for. With this in mind, it's actually therefore unsurprising that the difference between the different political parties on imperial policy was less than is sometimes assumed. It's often thought Gladstone was anti-imperial, and that Disraeli and other prominent Tories who came after him were pro-imperial, but it wasn't that clear-cut. Gladstone didn't have anything against the Dominions, and he didn't think that the British should leave India. He was even one around to the necessity of invading and occupying Egypt in 1882, believing that this would strengthen the trade route through the Suez Canal out to India. What he did oppose was warfare. He didn't like it, feeling that it was a waste of money and that it actually more or less harmed Britain's influence in the world. This is interesting because this assumes that Gladstone did want Britain to have a global role, just that he wanted it to be less about the business end of rifles and more about diplomacy and the so-called civilising mission. And neither were the Tories advocates of all imperial policies. After all, as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1866, Disraeli had written to the Prime Minister Lord Derby to say, quote, "What is the use of these colonial deadweights which we do not govern? Leave the Canadians to govern themselves, recall the African squadron, give up the settlements on the west coast of Africa, and we shall make a saving which will, at the same time, enable us to build ships and have a good budget." The British liked the imperialism and the bits of the empire that didn't cost them a huge amount of money, and they tended to dislike a little bit more the bits that would lead to taxation and having to dig deep into the public coffers. So in conclusion, I don't think that there was a wild fluctuation from no imperialist sentiment to lots of public support for imperialism between the 1880s and 1902. We started today's lecture by looking at some sources. There were a vast amount of sources that supported empire over the whole of the period, from newspapers to novels to theatrical shows to works of art to adverts. Whilst all of this stuff can't be seen as implicitly assuming imperial support, I think that on the whole, more people supported the empire than didn't. The newspapers that were pro-imperial sold the most. If someone was felt to be implementing policies that would endanger the empire, it would hurt them politically, such as what happened with Gladstone and his resignation regarding Gordon in Sudan, which led to Lord Salisbury getting into power. Also, you can read election manifestos. These are full of claims that the opposing party would endanger the empire if voted in. This is a sure sign that people liked the empire, because it's obviously a well-known fact that politicians will invariably avoid saying things that would cost them any votes. However, just saying that yes, the people were imperialist is a bit one-sided, and it fails to take into account the sheer diversity of the empire and the accompanying sheer diversity of different policies. Instead, people supported certain imperial policies but opposed others. The calculations as to what policies to support were determined by a variety of factors. Some parts of the empire were felt to be so naturally a part of the empire, or very few, so that no one or very few people seriously thought that these should be anything else other than tied to Britain. But the new bits of empire, the bits that hadn't been a part of the empire for a long time, and the bits which would be more expensive to conquer, were the bits that the British felt more ambivalent about, more uncertain. So whilst a support for the British Empire as an abstract concept was strong, people had very different ideas about how to translate that concept into reality.